Welcome back to my channel. I'm Elena, and in today's video, we're going to make scrappy binding. I'm going to show you my tips, my techniques, and the tools that I use to make this without a hassle. So, if you're tired of pins, tired of perfectionism, or even if you feel intimidated by quilting, then this video is for you. As a quilter and published quilt pattern designer with years of experience, mistakes and failures, I have discovered tried and true methods to make stunning quilts with less hassle. As I've completed countless projects, I learned that quilting is not about perfection or precision. I learned that quilting is about creativity, resourcefulness, and it's about creating something beautiful. Let me share a little backstory. In the beginning, when I started quilting, I only had a fat quarter bundle, and I decided to make a quilt that is Peter Pan themed, and I'm going to show it to you right now. This is my very first quilt. So having only a fat quarter bundle and the background fabric, I had a really difficult time trying to match the fabric that I used in the quilt to something that would match for the binding. So I was resourceful. And the best thing that I could think about is to cut the scraps that I had left over from each fat quarter and to stitch them together and create my very first scrappy binding. I did not know at that time that this method is called scrappy binding. Now, every time I look at this quilt, I am reminded that quilting is about resourcefulness, it's about creativity, and it's about the fact that every single stitch counts. Every stitch, every fabric, and every pattern tells a story, your story. So ask yourself, what if we celebrate the quirks and imperfections of each project and embrace the uniqueness of our quilts? But before we dive in, make sure you click that subscribe button and click the notification bell. This way, you will be reminded every time I post a new video. Thank you for helping our quilting community grow. In this video, I'm going to show you the tips, tricks, and tools that I use to make this more efficient, such as the diagonal seam tape. In binding, trust me, it's a game changer. Also see how I use my press as you go method for pressing my binding and how I use this to create a little binding stash to use for future projects. In this video, we're going all in. We're going to sew the entire binding by machine. You're going to see how I use my seam allowance at 3/8 of an inch instead of a 1/4 inch, which is the traditional way. And I use that because I like my binding to be a little bit fuller and to show a little bit more around my quilt than a 1/4 inch binding would. Now, let's address the elephant in the sewing room. This video is not for perfectionists. It's for busy moms, passionate beginners, and anyone who thinks that creating beautiful heirlooms is more important than perfect corners. It's quilting that works and fits into your busy lives. I have created a free PDF download for binding instructions that you can have as a reference, and you can grab that on my website. Now, let's get started. So these are the tools that I used to make today's scrappy binding. I am storing it on this churn dash binding holder. This is the excess, the binding that I did not use, so I'm saving this for later. Isn't that pretty? I use a rotary cutter, an Alpha rotary cutter. This is 45mm with a blade and a cutting mat. Using a cutting mat is dependent on your preference. I'm just showing here a little sample of a cutting mat. You can use one that is the size of your table or whatever size you're comfortable with. And I'm also using a ruler. In today's video, I use the 3 inches by 18 inches by Fiskars. I like to use this one because 18 inches is basically the size of a fat quarter, and having it 3 inches wide, it's actually easy to hold in my hand, easy to get in and out of the way. Another ruler that I used is this Creative Grids ruler, which is 6.5 by 1.5 inches. I like this one for ease of use. It's easy to hold in my hand and grab, and I use it generally to check my 1/4 inch seam allowance or to measure the seam allowance that I'm going to use in today's video. Speaking of measuring seam allowances, I used the Sew Standard Seam Guide by It's Sew Emma, and today's binding I stitched it with a 3/8 seam allowance. So this binding tool, or this seam allowance tool, has a 1/4 inch check mark up there. I can actually show you how to use this in a future video if you're interested. But I use the 3/8 mark, and I'm showing you in my video how to use the seam guide. I used a misting spray bottle because we have really hard water where we live. So I spray my fabric instead of using steam in my iron. And I use my little iron. It's a pure steam iron. It's 1800 watts. It's pretty strong. And the googly eyes do not come pre-installed from factory. To separate my threads, I used the Gypsy Quilter seam cutter. So this will help separate, when you're chain piecing, it helps separate your blocks. Some binding clips or sewing clips. Used pins. I like to use skinny and long pins in my quilting when I do use them. I used the 1/4 inch seam tape. This is by Cluck Cluck Sew, and I'm going to show you in the video how to use this. This is magical. I love it. I used Aurifil thread, and this is color 2021. It's generally a neutral color. And this is 50 weight quilting cotton thread. A sewing machine needle. This is a 9014 needle. It's universal. And a hand sewing needle with the Aurifil thread. And this we're going to use at the end if we have any pieces of binding that did not catch on the back. And you'll see, because this entire tutorial is using machine binding. Next, I used fabric marking pencils. Pencils or pens. If you're working with dark fabrics, you can use something that is based on chalk, just like the Sew Line pen. It has an eraser and a little very precise tip. I used in today's video this little friction pen. It is not necessarily rated for fabric, but actually it does come off with heat. When you apply the heat from your iron, it'll come off. It's a little bit controversial in the quilting world because some people say that if you're exposing your quilt to extreme temperatures, the markings might come back, but I have never had that happen. I used school glue. You can use a glue stick or you can use liquid school glue. I actually used this craft bond, and the reason I used it is because it comes with this precise applicator tip, and that is very convenient when I'm putting my binding on. And it's actually a squeeze tube too, so it works really well. For my sewing machine, I used several feet, and we're going to talk about them. This is the general feet that sewing machine foot that my machine comes with, and if the needle hits right in the center of it, then it's about a 3/8 seam allowance. So this is what I chose to sew my binding with today, is a 3/8 seam allowance. So I used this foot, but to piece my binding together, I just had the 1/4 inch foot. This is what I generally have on my sewing machine anyway, most of the time, because I am quilting a lot. If you choose to bind your quilt using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then a 1/4 inch foot will be very helpful. Because I bound my binding to the quilt, I used stitch in a ditch foot. This particular foot has a little metal edge right here. I don't know if you can see that very clearly. This metal edge helps stay inside a seam, so it helps you maintain that straight line. So I have two different kinds. This one allows my needle to be moved left and right, so I can change needle position, so I can determine the distance from the center of where I want to sew. But there is another type of foot that I also have. They do the same job, but this one only has one tiny hole in the middle, so will help your seams be a little bit more accurate. But this also has that little metal guide in the center. So that is a stitch in a ditch foot. But if you do not have that foot and you have a foot like this with a big gap, this is called an open toe foot, then you can use that as well, so that you can see exactly where your needle is going to go through the fabric. So I have one that is metal and I have one that is clear, so I can see through it. The binding that I'm going to make today is going to be for this very colorful quilt. Generally, when you have a quilt, you will have your blocks going all the way to the edge. But for this particular quilt, I added a 2-inch border because I want to be able to have my binding as wide as I can. And these corners right here will not get clipped off if I choose to have a binding that is wider than 1/4 inch. So for this quilt, I'm going to do 3/8 of an inch seam allowance that allows me to go all the way around and not worry about clipping the corners right next to my block. It gives me that extra room. The fabric I'm using today are these 5 fat quarters. They are very pretty printed. These are Emma fabric by Sherry and Chelsea. And I'm going to make a scrappy binding for this. Before we get started, it's a very good idea, especially after you've had fat quarters stored for a while, to iron them. So I'm going to use my wool pressing mat, which is approximately the size of a fat quarter. As you can see, I'm smoothing everything out because I want to get rid of all these lines. I don't have an expensive iron, I just have a basic one. The googly eyes did not come with the iron, I put those on there. But in Florida we have really hard water, so I'm going to use this misting bottle just to spray the entire surface of the fabric. I like to get my fabric pretty soaked at this point. I use just water, I don't use any starch product or anything, but this will help me press my fabrics really nice and neat. And it helps preserve the life of my iron. It helps preserve the life of my pressing mat. So once I have everything soaked, I'm going to have my iron on the highest setting, believe it or not. Even though this is an cotton fabric, I actually have it one setting higher. And I'm just going to iron everything until I see that the fabric is mostly dried off. This iron actually is pretty strong. It's 1800 watts. I like to go with generally a cheap iron, as cheap as strong as I can find, because we are a military family. We do move a lot, and generally speaking, when you move with the military, something will get broken. So I would hate for my expensive stuff to get broken, so I generally go with cheaper things. I do like to layer my fabrics on top of each other because once I do this, the fabric underneath somehow still continues to get pressed. It's still exposed to that heat. So I'm just stacking all my 5 fat quarters at the same time and pressing them. And then I'm going to flip them over and press them again and make sure that they're completely dry before I cut them. After the fabric is ironed and pressed, I lined up all the selvage edges for all my fabrics. What I'm trying to do here is make sure that they are perfectly stacked where one of the edges is matched perfectly. The reason for that is because I'm going to cut these fabrics at the same time. Not necessarily all 5 of them, but I'm going to sort them into groups of 2 and 3, and this will speed up the process. So I'm separating 2 of the fabrics, and what I'm doing is lining up the selvage edges with the raw edges of the fabric, and this ensures that they are folded in half perfectly, and I got the other fabrics out of the way. On my ruler, I've put a piece of washi tape at the 2.5 inch mark, and this will be a quick reminder of where I need to cut. It helps my brain just not worry about which line on the ruler do I need to cut on, but also if you put the tape on the back of your ruler, it'll help create a very small ledge. You can actually stack a few layers of tape, a ledge again where the fabric can rest against. I'm going to use my 45 millimeter rotary cutter, and this is an Alpha rotary cutter. I use this for basically everything. This is not necessarily the blade that I use when I want precision, but because I'm cutting through so many layers of fabric, I'm using this one. So it's important to get that straight edge onto the left side. I am right-handed, so the left side of my fabric is what matters, and you can do that in several ways. But what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to cut the width of my ruler. I'm going to line up the left edge, and I'm also going to line up the fold on the bottom of my fabric with the horizontal lines of the ruler. If you have it a little bit skewed, your fabric strips will not be straight. So it's important to line up all those marks horizontally with the fold of your fabric so you can have straight strips because you're cutting them straight in half. So I'm cutting it at 3 inches. And once I cut this strip of fabric, I do need to have it at 2.5. So what I'm going to do is turn it around, and the straight edge that I cut, I'm going to line that one with my 2.5-inch mark on my ruler, and I'm going to cut the excess 1/2 inch away. Now this will ensure that I have a 2.5-inch strip. It also helps straighten up my fabric, so this way I can continue to cut through the fabric at 2.5-inch intervals. So I have my 2 strips cut. I'm going to put those aside, and I'm going to line up my ruler again at the 2.5-inch mark. You want to make sure that you have the edges lined up and that you're going to cut straight. Remember, we talked about having the side edge onto the left side, again, if you're right-handed, and having the bottom fold lined up as well. That's your exact 90-degree angle, especially when you're cutting folded fabric. If that angle is not 90 degrees, your fabric will not come up in a straight line. So let me show you real quick. It would be a little bit skewed. It would have a little curve right there in the middle if it would not be 90 degrees. So I'm going to speed up the camera and I'm going to continue cutting my fabric. Once I have all my fabric strips cut, it's important to have these short edges lined up at a 90-degree angle as well. And the reason for that is because that is the side where we're going to sew them together. So I want those to be pretty accurate as well. So I'm going to cut the selvage edges, and the way I can do that is I'm going to stack my fabrics, all my strips, by lining up the straight edges that I cut, so the long sides, and I'm going to also line up my selvage edges. I'm going to grab one of the short rulers, one of my small ones, just to make sure that it's easier to maneuver, and I'm going to line up again the horizontal lines on my ruler with the straight edges that I have cut, easily trim that selvage edge off, and now I have a straight edge. And you can do the same with the other end of the fabric if it is not straight, but some of them will already be straight. So I'm going to show you this method. This is doing just a couple of strips at a time, but you can also line up your fabric and cut it all at the same time. So let me show you quickly how to do that. So I'm going to take these pile of strips and show you how I can line them up and cut them all at the same time. I've basically reconstructed the fat quarter, so you could have done this as well before you cut the strips, but I prefer to do it afterwards. I don't know why, but to me it's just a little bit easier doing it afterwards. I feel like I'm getting a more accurate cut of the long strips without cutting the selvage edges first. It's very easy for me to line up the selvage edges. So once they are all cut, now I know that those are ready to be sewn. I'm going to quickly check the other end, and they are pretty straight, pretty at a 90-degree angle, so I'm just going to leave them as they are. I'm going to layer the second stack of strips on my cutting mat, and I'm going to line up on the right side the selvage edges of the strips, and I'm going to rest against each other the long edges that I have previously cut. The reason I'm doing this is because binding is not extremely precise. It is very forgiving, and my philosophy when quilting is that as long as it is done, it's complete, nobody's going to notice the mistakes. You have to forgive yourself. You have to have fun with it. So if it comes to a point where quilting is no longer fun because I am too worried about how precise I am with it, then to me it's not worth doing. So as soon as I cut these strips off, the selvage edges off the strips, I'm going to figure out what order do I want to sew these binding strips in. I can go with the contrasting colors. together. I could go in a rainbow side together, but what I'm worried about is the scale and the color. So for example, this red in the yellow fabric matches that red in the flower, so that would be something that would go well together. But the scale on that is a little bit too big, so I think I want to mix it up a little bit. I do like the rainbow gradual order of these fabrics, but I'm going to switch it up and have a smaller scale fabric such as this pink one in between the two larger scales. So as you can see, this green fabric, the scale on this is a little bit smaller than the yellow, and it's also smaller than the blue, so I like that alternating order of fabric. So I think that's what I'm going to go with. On my machine, I have installed my 1/4 inch foot. I like that it snaps on and off. It does not have a little stopper at the end, like a little edge where you can rest your fabric against. But I do have my 1/4 inch foot, and the base plate has one tiny hole, and I have a video separate about this, about the base plate on my machine. But the center line is right here onto this little plate, and the little plate is a little wobbly and it moves, and it makes it a little bit difficult for me to find the center line, because I want to sew these pieces together without using pins, so it's important to have a center line. I'm going to use a diagonal seam tape, and I'm going to show you how I apply it. So I just tear off a piece. This is a paper, kind of like washi tape, so you can easily tear it off. And I'm going to line it as straight as I can, and I'm going to put it right over my feed dogs. I want to make sure when I'm applying this that the needle is going to be exactly on the red line. To me, that is the center line, and on each side of the red line there are two black lines, and those are exactly a 1/4 inch apart. I'm using the tape from Cluck Cluck Sew. I know that it is accurate. I know on Amazon there are lots of other tapes, but I know for a fact that this one is accurate, so I'm not going to risk anything else. And one of these rolls lasts you a while. So once I apply it, I'm going to take a little pin when I'm happy with where that needle is hitting, and I'm going to just score the tape, and I'm going to remove the excess. The reason I put it under the feed dog is to perfectly line it up under my needle. And now my feed dogs are free, and I can easily continue sewing my fabrics. So when you're joining binding strips, it is important to put them right sides together. It is also important to stitch them at a 45-degree angle, so it would look something like this. The reason we do that is because when you're folding the binding in half, you want to reduce the bulk of the seam overlapping itself. So if we do sew it at a 45-degree angle, as you can see at 90 degrees, that would create two seams on top of each other, and that would be a little bit bulky. But if we offset it a little bit, then we would have less bulk when the two seams overlap. So the way we do that is about a 1/4 inch away from the short edge of each binding strip, I'm going to layer the second strip at a 90 degrees, so perpendicular to each other. Now, is that a perfect 1/4 inch? Not necessarily, but you get the idea. So what you can do is you can pin them. So what you want to do is you're going to stitch on the diagonal on that square that is being comprised. So what you want to do is you want to keep the short edges on one side of your seam and the long edges on the other side. Because if you would sew them that way right across, then that would be a bad day. They would not work out. So think about it, short edges on one side of your seam, long edges on the other side of your seam, and your stitch line should go from one corner, one intersection, to the other, exactly into that little gap. After this, you'll see what we're going to do. So you do want to leave that 1/4 inch on each side. It's going to help you with the seam allowance. So I'm going to move my pin, and I'm going to put it outside of the imaginary line where I'm going to stitch. In the beginning, when I started quilting, I was pinning a lot, and I was actually drawing that diagonal line. But because I've put this little tape on my machine, I'm going to take that intersection where I want my seam to start, and I'm going to put it right against the needle. And the bottom part of that intersection is going to be actually right onto the red line. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to put my needle down, and then that red line is exactly where those little gaps are, the intersections are. And this way you can continue sewing back to back. So I'm putting these on, putting it right against the needle, and I can just go for it as long as the intersection is right onto that red line, because I know that's exactly where my needle is going to be. Using this method saves me a lot of time when I'm making scrappy binding, because I don't have to use pins, I don't have to draw diagonal lines. All I have to do is align the intersection of the two fabrics with the red line and just keep sewing. And I'm going to continue to do this until I finish all of my strips. So I'm sewing the strips to the beginning of one strip, and then I'm going to find the end of that strip and sew a new strip to that. So basically it's a long chain. As you can see, I'm attaching the red to the blue, and then to the other end of the red I'm attaching the pink. So I still remember the order of my strips, following it by yellow, green, and blue. So I'm going to continue that until I finish all of my strips. So by now, with all of these strips together out of 5 fat quarters, I have about 50 feet of binding, which is clearly much more than I need for this one quilt that I'm making, but it's going to be useful. All of these are attached together because I didn't cut the threads in between. This is called chain piecing. So now it's time to cut them apart. So here we are at my ironing table, and now my binding strips are, because I strip sewed them, they are sewn together like a banner. So I'm going to use this little thread cutter. It has a blade in there and a guide. It's very easy to cut the thread. You're just going to hold the two pieces and run the thread right over the blade. And I do like that it's pretty narrow, so it's very easy not to cut yourself with it. It's pretty safe. And honestly, it's quite fun. So I'm going to speed up this video so you can see how I'm cutting all of these threads apart, and I'm going to end up with one giant long piece of binding. Cutting my seams apart is actually pretty fun for me. It's a mindless activity that helps relax me. So now that I have this long piece of binding, I'm going to find the end, and I want to make sure that all of my seams are going in the same direction. That is just one of my pet peeves, but if they're going in opposite directions from each other, as you can see, these are all going towards the left side. If they're going one to the left, one to the right, it would not be a big deal unless that really does bother you. So I want to make sure that all of my seams are right and they're on the correct side of the fabric, that I didn't sew the wrong side to the right side of other pieces. And once I verified that all my seams are right, we're going to cut off that excess. So we're going to cut away a 1/4 inch away from the seam line. You can't really see this because I used white thread, a thread that matches, but I'm going to grab my ruler and I'm going to see exactly, approximately actually, where a 1/4 inch would be. So you can use a rotary cutter and you can cut that, but for me, because I have so many of these seams, I'm just going to eyeball and use my scissors. I really like this process as well. You can cut those little bunny ears that are left over, but I usually leave mine on. It doesn't bother me at all, and at the end, after I have sewn my binding to my quilt, those bunny ears will naturally stick out, and I can just go around my quilt and trim them off at that time anyway. Because my binding pieces are already sewn together, having an accurate 1/4 inch during the cutting these excess, it does not really matter much. So what you want to do now is you're going to warm up your iron at the setting that you prefer, because it's time to start folding and ironing your binding. What you want to do is you want to press those seams open, because that will help reduce the bulk. So you can either finger press or you can use your iron to press them. So what we're going to do is, wrong sides together, we're going to fold this binding in half. So I'm lining up the long edges of the binding. You could do this as bias tape as well, but for quilts, to make them more durable, you want to have a double layer to make it last a little bit longer. You could finger press a little bit when you want to make sure that your fold is right. I'm being very careful here so I don't burn myself, but I'm ironing those seams open. And once you do that, as you can see, they're a little bit offset. So one seam is going to the left and the other seam is going to the right. You can actually see the little bunny ears sticking out. That's what I meant, that we can cut them later. But I don't have that double seam overlapping in the middle. So this is going to help reduce the bulk, especially when you're going to sew it to your quilt and you're going to fold that in half another time. It will make it durable and it will last for a while. So you can continue that for the remainder of your quilt. Every time I get to an intersection of or a seam, I'm going to finger press it or use my iron to press it open. Like I said, you can definitely do this part first and then you can fold your binding in half. I just like to press it as I go, take a little break, press those seams open, and then continue folding my binding in half. So my binding came out to about 50 feet. Like I said, I'm not going to use all of this for my quilt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to store it for later. I want to have it organized. So I'm using this Riley Blake churn dash binding keeper or binding holder, and I'm putting the binding through that tiny hole in the middle and just wrapping it around. This will preserve and hold my binding in a really neatly organized way, and every time I have a scrappy project I can come to this little stash of binding and get what I need. I like to make my binding ahead of time because just as you're done with your quilt and you think you're fully done, you don't want to end up having to do your binding too. It's kind of like when you're doing dishes and you think you're done and you turn around and there are 3 pots on the stove and you have to start all over again. I like to do my binding before I sew my quilt, or I want to do, like I just did now, a big long strip of binding so I can use for other projects as well. So if at any other point I have just a little bit of time, all I'm going to do is do the project and then come to my stash and grab this binding real quick. I really like the way these colors fit together. I think they're very pretty, and I'm going to wrap this around, and there's my binding. Now for the quilt, when you are attaching it to your quilt, you don't want to start sewing right at the edge. You want to also start sewing somewhere in the middle of your quilt. So I'm measuring about 10 inches, I want to say. Leave that unstitched, unsewn, and you're going to basically clip it right there in the middle and measure approximately how much you're going to need for your quilt. You're going to put raw edges together, both on the binding and on the quilt. And I'm going to sew this binding to the front of my quilt, leaving that flap hanging. Now, each pattern that you have is going to generally come with the instructions on how much binding you need to cut and how much fabric you would need for the binding. But because I'm not following a pattern right now and I'm just making up my binding as I go, and I made a big stash of it, I'm going to measure how much I need. What I'm paying attention to here is this corner of the quilt and that seam. I want to make sure that none of my seams end up in the corner. So again, like I like to eyeball things, I'm eyeballing how much binding I would need to make sure that the seams in my binding strips are far away from the corners. This will help later on not have a lot of bulk. So I'm going all the way around, checking for the corners, making sure that they don't really have seams. This one's a little bit close, but I think it's going to be okay. And once I get to the end, I'm going to leave another tail that is about 10 inches because that's where we're going to join those binding strips. That one is a little bit close too, but I have plenty of room to work with. And once I get to the end and I'm happy with how much binding I have, I'm going to cut it in between the blue and the red. So it doesn't matter. We can unpick that seam if we want, but I'm just going to use my scissors and cut it straight. What this end looks like, it doesn't really matter because at the end we're going to cut this off anyway after we stitch the red and the blue end of the binding together. And now I'm going to save this binding for later and use it in other projects that are just as colorful and vibrant as this one. To attach the binding to my quilt, I'm going to use binding clips or sewing clips. And I purchased these on Amazon, but I'm not actually going to pin all around the quilt. I'm only going to pin or clip the side that I'm working on all the way to the corner. And I'm going to be reusing the same clips all around my quilt. So again, raw edges together. Just clip every 6 inches or so, or whatever you feel comfortable with. I don't really like to clip or pin, so I'm just using as little clips as I can. I'm going to use another one too. And now, after they are clipped, let's go to the sewing machine and sew this together. Generally, quilt binding is sewn a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge of your quilt and your binding, but I'm going to actually use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. That means 3 little lines on from the edge of my ruler. And the reason I do that is because a 3/8 of an inch, it still gives me enough to fold over and have a fuller binding. Now, as I'm sewing 3/8 of an inch away from one end to the other, I'm actually going to stop 3/8 of an inch away from the corner of my quilt. And that will help me turn the corner and be a lot more accurate. To correctly identify that 3/8 seam, I'm going to use the seam guide to see exactly where 3/8 of an inch is. So my seam guide has a little hole for 3/8, and that's what I'm going to follow. I'm going to gently lower my needle into that, and I'm going to put my presser foot down to hold that ruler in place, and I can see that the edge of the ruler is actually the edge of my regular presser foot for my sewing machine. So I've switched my presser foot for the general one instead of the 1/4 inch that I had before, and that will be my mark. And this also coincides with the very edge of the diagonal seam tape. So not the black line, but the very edge of the tape. So that's what I'm going to follow. I'm going to run my quilt along that line, and that will be my guide. When you're sewing your binding to your quilt, in the beginning and the end of the binding, you want to make sure that you are securing your stitches. So if your machine has a little lock stitch button, you can use that, or you can use the reverse button and just go back and forth on your stitches. Again, remember, leave those first 10 inches unstitched so you can join your binding at the end. And let's start sewing. Again, I'm following the seam guide that I have put on, so that would be 3/8 of an inch for me. You can do a 1/4 inch if you choose to. And I'm going to start sewing. Once I put my needle down and I do my very first stitch, I like to take my clip off, and that needle down is going to actually hold my binding in place. I'm securing my stitches, and I am adjusting the speed on my machine to something that I'm comfortable with, and I'm going to sew this entire side. Remember, I only clipped this side. I didn't clip anywhere else because I like to work in sections. Once I get to the corner of my quilt, I'm going to stop 3/8 of an inch away from the corner. So you want to stop at the same distance as your seam allowance is. So if you're going with a 1/4 inch, you're going to stop a 1/4 inch away. If you're doing 3/8 of an inch, you can stop 3/8 of an inch away, or 1/2 inch seam allowance, depending how wide your binding is, you can stop 1/2 inch away from the corner. Over those intersections, it should go very smoothly over the seams that you have already sewn. And I know this is a little bit bulky, so if you do have a walking foot on your machine, for example, my machine has an integrated walking foot, you can kind of see it behind my needle going there. But if you have a walking foot that you need to install on your sewing machine, go ahead and do that. So I have a removable pen. It's not necessarily for fabric, it's called a friction pen. And on my ruler, I'm going to measure my 3/8, so that is 3 dots, 1, 2, 3. And that is where I'm going to mark from either side. So from the bottom side of my quilt edge and from the right side of my quilt. And that will create a tiny, tiny little 3/8 of an inch square. As you can see, I'm measuring 3/8 from one side. If you are choosing to go with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then you will measure a 1/4 inch. I'm putting the dots there. This pen is removable with heat and with water, but it's a little bit controversial because it's not fully designed for quilts. So I'm putting my binding on top of the marking that I made, and I am transferring that little dot that I put on my quilt onto the binding. So now I know that will be my stopping point. So as I'm stitching forward, coming to the dot, once I get to there, I'm going to draw a line straight from the dot exactly to the corner of my quilt, and I'm going to stitch on that line. So going all the way to the dot, to the mark that I have put in there. And now I'm going to pivot my quilt so that I can stitch a straight line from the dot that I have put on all the way to the corner of my quilt. And don't worry, if you didn't get a good look at this, I'm going to do this again and you'll get to see how I'm pivoting the corner. I don't have to go back and forth on this one, but this is what it should look like. So now when you're going to pivot on the corner, as soon as you get your quilt out of the way, this is why you need a big table to sew on, you're going to see that that diagonal line is actually going to help our binding lay flat. So flip your binding upside down, and you want the raw edge of the binding to kind of continue in the same direction as your quilt, and the fold of the binding will actually be at a 90-degree angle. So once that is folded up, you're going to hold your binding and now fold it back down, but this time you're going to create a fold that is exactly lining up with the top edge of your quilt, and I'm going to show that to you in a second. Once I have the binding where I want it, I'm going to clip the edges on the right side of my quilt, and I'm going to show you the top. So I have made a really nice and neat fold at the top, that little flap. It's important that the fold on that flap is exactly lined up with the top, and if you flip it over sideways, it's exactly lined up with the right edge as well. So I'm going to start stitching all the way from the end, 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to secure the stitches this time, so this way my quilt corner does not unravel during the wash. So just clip that out of the way to maintain that beautiful fold, and you're going to continue sewing all the way with a 3/8 seam allowance. Remember to secure your stitches at the top of the corner as you're starting to sew. One thing that I do like to do is to be careful of the weight of your quilt. If you don't have a large table, the weight of your quilt tends to pull the quilt down a little bit. So as you're stitching a few inches, make sure you stop and realign your quilt and kind of balance that weight. Look on the left side of the screen how my quilt is dragging down, and that makes my seam go crooked. So I'm going to stitch just a few inches and then readjust my quilt. And it is a little bit tedious at some point, but it is totally worth it for a beautiful quilt. As I reach one of my binding clips, if you pay attention, I've only used like 4 clips. I'm going to either remove it or I'm going to pull it off and reposition it on the lower side of my binding. So I like to do this all the way around. I only clip a few sections at a time because while I'm sewing, the fabric tends to shift, so it's not going to necessarily always going to line up. So I have my clip right there. I'm just sliding it down a little bit to maintain the next few inches of what I'm sewing in place, and I can just do that for the remainder of the quilt. So you don't actually need too many clips or pins to put binding on a quilt. This particular quilt is about 40 inches by 40 inches, so it's not that big. It's like a little baby quilt, and it's very forgiving. So you have more freedom, more room to work with it. My sewing machine is pretty big as well. It has an 11 inches throat space, so I could do quite a lot of things with this one. So here's another view of how I sew my binding. Hopefully you get to see this one better. I'm going to stitch the binding at 3/8 seam allowance, 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, and to me, coincidentally, that is the same size as my presser foot, so that's easy to do. And I slide my clip over. I have mentioned that previously, where I don't use too many clips. I just use the same one and I stitch in sections. So once I get close to the corner of my quilt, I'm going to get ready to mark the pivot point of where I'm going to stop sewing. So I'm going to use my quilt corner as a reference, but this time I'm going to mark it directly on top of the binding. So I'm going to use my disappearing pen. At this point, this part of the binding will be enclosed, and it will be covered up. So if you want to use a pencil or anything else that does not show through, you can, but it's always a good idea to have disappearing type of pens around your sewing machine so you do not make mistakes. So I'm measuring 3/8 of an inch from both sides of the corner of my quilt, and I'm marking with a little cross. So I'm going to stitch all the way up to the intersection of that cross, and then I'm going to pivot my quilt and stitch off the corner. So I'm stopping right there. I'm going to manipulate my quilt, rotate it 45 degrees, and line up the corner of the quilt with that center line on my diagonal seam tape or with my presser foot center line, and just veer off the corner. I'm not reinforcing my stitches, but after this you'll get to see how I turn the quilt around and flip the binding over. So here we go, doing this one more time. Take your binding strip, flip it over so you will have the raw edges of the quilt and the raw edge of your binding basically in a straight line. You want to line that up. So this will create the fold in your binding that is 45 degrees away from the corner of your quilt, but also that actual fold, it would be 90 degrees. Bring it back down over itself until that fold is exactly lined up with the top of your quilt. And once you find that little sweet spot, you can get a clip and hold that binding in place. So let's do this again. Here is another view from the top. You can see my stitch line, and as you can see, the binding is going straight up, and then hold it on the left side, bring it down, make sure that that fold is straight with the edge of the top of the quilt. I like to fix the little corner so you can't really see the underside of the binding. Clip it, and it just looks beautiful. That's what it should look like. So when you fold that in either direction, that little corner can line up with the right side of the quilt, or it can line up with the top of the quilt. So I'm choosing to keep it lined up with the top of the quilt. I like to just gently pin the corner of it in a place where the clip is not in the way and stitch all the way around, and you will repeat that with all 4 corners on your quilt. Remember to reinforce your stitches as you're starting the edge of the quilt because you want that corner to stay in place. So in this video you can see the little bunny ears that I mentioned previously from the binding strips being sewn together, just sticking out outside of the binding. So at the end, once you've sewn the entire binding on to the front of your quilt, you can come with a rotary cutter and a long ruler and you can trim those, or you can just use scissors and trim the extra threads that are sticking out. You can trim those bunny ears and give it a really nice clean cut. Remember when we measured our binding, we left an excess of like 10 inches over? So this is the end of my binding strip. I've actually unstitched the last piece and we need to sew these together. I stopped sewing the binding strip about another 10 inches. So now we're going to try to join these together. You want to join them at a 45-degree angle, very similarly to what we did prior to. So what I'm doing, since the red strip is already at a 45-degree angle, I'm just going to draw directly onto my blue strip of binding where my seam line is going to be. And I think that this is the easiest way to do it because I'm literally drawing my seam line. It's already drawn onto the red strip because I unpicked those stitches so I can see the old seam line, but you can see that diagonal line where those two should meet. Now if you want to do this, you can actually, if you don't have the end of a strip conveniently right there, what you can do is actually cut the end of your binding at a 45-degree angle and you can continue that way. So you're going to take your quilt and fold it to get that extra bulk out of the way and make sure that those binding strips are close to each other so you have lots of room to work with. So you can see my quilt is really bunched up in there, and I'm getting my binding strips and I'm doing my best to stay in focus in camera to show you. I'm putting them right sides together and I'm trying to match those two lines. So the seam line, a quarter inch away from the red binding strip, to put it exactly onto the line that I had just finished drawing. And after I do this, this is a part where I do use lots of pins because I want to be as accurate as possible.
And after I pin this, I'm just going to stitch directly on there. It helps on here if you make it a little bit tighter, and by a little bit I mean about 1/8 of an inch tighter than what you would normally use, because your binding is going to stretch a little bit once you stitch it to your quilt, so you don't want to have the binding bunched up. But after you sew it, you can actually measure and see if you have enough binding. Do not cut it immediately after you sew it, because you have to check it, and I'm going to show you how we do that. So you have to maneuver the quilt. It's a little bit bulky at this point, but remember, if you have left enough binding loose, not attached to the quilt, this will make it a little bit easier. Try to do your best to stitch directly onto the line that you have drawn, and this will make it easy to join those binding ends seamlessly. There are several tools that you can use for this, but I'm using the same method that I used when I joined the binding strips in the first place, which means the intersection of those two fabrics is on the red line of my diagonal binding tape, that diagonal seam tape. I'm taking all the pins out from my binding. Remember, you have that excess right there in that seam allowance, but I'm not going to cut that just yet because I want to make sure that I have the correct length of binding. So I'm going to take the pins out of my quilt, and this is the best part. You ready? Once you stretch your quilt, your binding should lay flat. And once you're happy and you make sure that you didn't sew it too tight or you didn't sew it too loose, because you don't want, again, that fabric, that binding to bunch up, you can go ahead and just use scissors or rotary cutter and cut that binding. If you have chose to press your binding joints with an iron, you could do that again, but what I like to do is just finger press it, fold it in half, and make sure that the seam lays flat. Again, you're going to press it open. I'm going to put a couple of clips in here because I want it to stay put, and then you can just simply continue sewing using the same seam allowance that you have used before. Remember to reinforce your stitches in the beginning at the end. So I'm going back and forth a couple of times, going all the way straight. And I'm going to overlap my seam just maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch into the previous seam, just to make sure that I don't have any gaps in my binding. I'm going all the way in the areas that my binding has not been sewn, and I'm going to reinforce my stitches again. Of my quilt, this is a good time to trim those threads if you choose to trim the bunny ears. I don't necessarily always do that. It will be enclosed within the binding itself anyway. It saves me time not to do it. But what I do, even if it takes a little bit of time, is that I use my iron and I press the binding open, and this will help me in the next step, because I'm going to sew this binding by machine, not by hand. And even if I was sewing it by hand, I would do the exact same thing. When I get to the corner, actually pressing it with the hot iron prior to sewing it helps it stay flat and helps your corners be a little bit more accurate. So I am not going to press the entire binding in right now, but I am going to gently press on that little corner. So go ahead and do this all the way around your quilt. On the back side of your quilt, you're going to fold your binding, and instead of pinning or clipping, we're actually going to use glue. But before I apply the glue, I'm going to press my binding. I am pushing with my thumb the quilt up, and I'm folding the binding over, so this way it's not bunched up. And because I don't want to do that while there's glue in there, I press it before I apply the glue. I am using Elmer's glue, Craft Fuse, or you can use Elmer's school glue or whatever glue you're comfortable with. I choose this one because of the little precision tip applicator. So now that my binding is already pre-folded, I don't have to put my fingers under the binding and get glue over my fingers. I can just gently fold it down where I had already pressed it and put the iron on. The iron is actually going to help set the glue and dry it instantly, so I don't have to hold it down with anything. I don't need clips and I don't need pins, and go ahead and do this all around your quilt. While you are attaching the binding to the back of your quilt, you're actually going to see the stitch line that you used to attach the binding to the front. It'll show on the back as well. So while you're folding your binding to the back, you want to be wide enough that it actually passes over the stitch line that you used to attach it to the front, if that makes sense. Because you have that very little extra excess that will allow you to stitch the binding by machine a little bit easier and makes sure that it catches the back of your binding by sewing it through the front, because you won't be able to see that. So in order to do that, what I'm going to use is a stitch and a ditch foot. It's usually a foot that attaches to your sewing machine that has a little guide in the middle, and usually that guide goes straight in onto a line that is a little bit not leveled to the rest of your fabric. So if it would be a stitch, for example, a stitch line, it would go around against that, or in our case, it's actually going to go against the binding. So let me show you what that looks like. So here it is, we are at the machine, and we can see how the middle of that foot, the little center metal plate, is riding right along the edge of the binding because it creates that little ledge. And you're going to start slow. It's very easy to veer left or veer right because of the weight of your quilt. Remember, just like when we sewed the binding the first time, your quilt is going to drag down a little bit. So it's important to go slow, just a few inches at a time. Turn your quilt over, make sure that the stitch from the front actually caught the binding on the back. And if it does not, then you can do that later on by hand. And I will show you how to do that. So go slow all the way around your quilt and make sure that you are as close to the binding as possible. And this is what it should look like. It creates a very discreet stitch on the back, but even more discreet on the front. So I really like the way this looks. It kind of helps finish up the quilt a little bit. So I zoomed in a little bit more so you get a better idea, a better view of how this foot and how close it is to the binding. So always keep an eye on where the needle is going to sew through, to make sure that you're not actually on the binding itself. Another thing that you can do is you can check with your fingernail straight into that ditch to make sure that you can feel the back of your binding. As you can see right there, it's very, very close to the edge, but it did catch all the binding on the back. If you have little threads and stuff, don't worry about that right now. You can trim all of that later. So again, go slow, take your time. This is a little bit more time consuming than the first step of sewing the binding was, but it is still a lot faster than sewing it by hand. And when you're pressed for time, you want to get all the shortcuts that you can, but get the same effect. Now I'm going to show you how I pivot at the corner. I'm always checking and stopping and checking to make sure that I caught the binding on the back. It is always a tiny little heart attack when thinking that there is a possibility that I did not catch it, but for the majority of the quilt I do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold over the corner as I'm approaching it, and I want to make sure that that flap sits nicely on the back, and you will gently fold it. Stop a few inches away from the corner. Again, I'm checking those stitches. As you can see, it looks really, really pretty on the front. That's if you adjust your tension correctly. And you can look in the back too. I have one spot that it didn't quite catch, but I can fix that later. So this is what the back should look like. And I'm going to stitch as close as I can to the horizontal binding, to that intersection, because I know if I'm stitching that close, I'm going to catch the binding on the back around the corner as well. So after I have stopped with my needle down, I'm just going to pivot my quilt. I'm trying to get the binding out of the way and still stitch as close to that as possible. In the beginning, when I did this the first time, I could not pivot very well. So this is a new skill that I have acquired, a new skill that I have unlocked to actually successfully catch the binding on the back in a corner. So it just takes practice, but anything that you can't catch with your sewing machine, you can do it by hand. So it looks really, really pretty on the front. And then on the back, you can kind of see that pivot right there. It's not perfect, but it will hold. If you want, you can reinforce it with a few hand stitches as well, but you might not need to do that. This will last a long time. I've actually had quilts that I have sewn using this method and bound using this method, and the only thing that has happened to them was giving them to my baby, who has chewed on the corners of it, and believe it or not, the binding still holds. This is a slightly different angle of how I'm turning the corner. You have to have your settings on your machine stopping with the needle down. And after you pivot, again, start slow. There is no rush on this step. Take your time because you want to be as accurate as possible. This will save you time later on from making corrections either on the machine or making corrections by hand. Because nothing that we do in quilting is perfect, I'm checking the back of my quilt, and I have a few areas where my binding didn't actually sew on the back. So I'm going to use needle and thread, and I'm just going to use a ladder stitch. So I've put a knot in my thread, and I'm actually going to bury that under the binding. And I like to stitch a little bit of the binding and a little bit onto the quilt itself. I'm just trying to take a little bite of the binding straight into that fold from the edge, just a few threads going in and out. I'm zooming in so you guys can see a little bit better. And then where my thread comes out, I'm going to do the exact same thing into the binding. This is a little bit difficult to keep it in focus because it is zoomed in so much, but I'm doing my best. And you just keep going like that into every area. Generally, you shouldn't have many areas to fix, but I like this method as of a ladder stitch because it's quite invisible. So it's not very noticeable at the end. If you want, you can try to do this with the sewing machine again, but to me, once I grab my needle, it's just a little bit faster. So this is what it should look like, literally like a ladder. And then when I pull the thread, my stitches will disappear.
Thank you for joining me today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and remember to share it with your fellow quilters. And sign up for my email to receive a free quilt pattern and behind-the-scenes peeks. Don't keep this video a secret, share it with your quilty friends. And remember to tag me. I would love to see your quilts. And by the way, if you liked this quilt, go ahead and grab a copy of the pattern on my website. Until next time, my friends, keep those machines sewing, embrace the wonky seams, and most importantly, have fun. Happy sewing!